Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're all about those cute, chatty northern palm squirrels you see all around northern India. We've got a 1968 scientific paper that studied their home ranges and territorial habits. Think of it as an early, squirrel census. Get ready? You might be surprised by what we learn about these little guys.
It is fascinating to see how this research from over 50 years ago still gives us valuable insights.
Exactly. And it's amazing how much information they were able to glean about these creatures' everyday lives. Okay, let's start with the concept of home range, which this study is all about. What exactly is a home range, and how is it different from a territory?
A home range is essentially the area where an animal spends most of its time doing its usual squirrel things, foraging, nesting, raising young. It doesn't necessarily mean they defend that whole area like a territory. Think of it this way. Your home range might be your entire town, but your territory is just your house and maybe your yard.
So you might tolerate someone driving through your town,
Hmm.
but not someone snooping around in your backyard.
Exactly. Now, this study found that male northern palm squirrels have a home range of about 0.21 hectares on average, while females have slightly smaller ranges, around 0.15 hectares.
That's roughly the size of a couple of tennis courts, right?
Mhm.
To me, that seems pretty small, especially when you consider those squirrels can be found just about everywhere in some cities.
It does seem small, but it actually tells us something interesting about their adaptability. The fact that their home ranges are so small suggests they can find most of what they need within a limited area. This might be because they're so good at utilizing a variety of food sources found in urban environments.
Makes sense, they're not picky eaters. Now, I found this really interesting. The study mentions a male squirrel who moves his home range quite a bit as he grew up, shifting it over 128 meters. Could this be because he needed more space as an adult, or was it something else?
It could be a combination of factors. As he matured, he might have needed more resources to attract a mate. Or perhaps competition from other males forced him to relocate. We need to consider that his move wasn't about defending a territory, but finding better opportunities within his home range.
Almost like he upgraded from a tiny apartment to a bigger place in a better part of town.
A very relatable analogy.
Now, the study also looked at something called observed range lengths, which is basically the furthest distances recorded between a squirrel's capture points. And guess what? Adult males had significantly longer range lengths compared to females or younger squirrels. Why is that?
Well, this ties into another fascinating finding from the study. The sex ratio among these squirrels is heavily skewed towards males. There are more than twice as many males as females in the population. And unlike females, male northern palm squirrels are promiscuous, meaning they mate with multiple females.
So it's like a squirrel dating app where the males have to swipe right a lot more to get a match.
Exactly. With fewer females to go around, males might be venturing further out to find potential mates.
Makes sense. Now let's talk about territorial behavior. Do these squirrels actually defend their space? Or are they more laid back about boundaries?
The study found that while these squirrels don't defend their entire home range, they do show territorial behavior around specific areas like nests, shelter spots, and even favorite perches on tree branches.
So you might see them squeaking and chasing each other away from their favorite napping spot. But they're less likely to get territorial over a random patch of grass.
That's right. Think of it this way. They might not care if another squirrel walks through their living room, but try touching their coffee mug and they'll put up a fight.
So it's all about what they consider truly valuable and worth defending. But I'm curious, are there any situations where they're more willing to share their space?
Actually, yes. Despite their territorial tendencies around certain areas, the study observed that these squirrels are surprisingly tolerant in feeding grounds. They often gather quite close to each other while foraging without any conflict.
So it seems like sharing is caring when it comes to food. I guess when there's plenty to go around, there's no need to fight. It's like the difference between someone taking your parking spot versus someone grabbing a cookie from a communal jar at a party.
That's a great way to put it. It seems like they understand that cooperation can sometimes be more beneficial than constant competition.
Which brings us to a fascinating question. What factors determine when an animal chooses to defend its space versus share it?
That is a great question. It could depend on the type of resource, its availability, and even the social dynamics within the population.
It's like a complex cost-benefit analysis where they're constantly weighing the risks and rewards of different behaviors. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The study actually went a step further and measured the home ranges of individual squirrels as they matured.
And what did they find?
Well, they discovered that for some of the males, their home ranges changed dramatically in size as they transition from subadults to adults. One, in particular, started with a tiny 0.02 hectare home range that's less than half a tennis court.
That's an incredibly small space for a squirrel.
Right. But then, as he matured, his home range expanded to a whopping 0.37 hectares. That's more than 3 times its original size. He essentially moved from a studio apartment to a sprawling penthouse.
That's quite a transformation. What could have caused such a dramatic change? Was it about finding more food? Or could it be related to finding a mate?
It's a real mystery. What do you think, listener? Why do you think the squirrel's home range expanded so much? Keep that question in mind as we dig deeper into the study's findings.
It's like he was playing a real-life game of King of the Hill, trying to secure the best spot in town.
Exactly. And speaking of competition, this paper also delves into how scientists actually figure out these home ranges. It's not like they can just ask a squirrel for its address.
Indeed. In this study, they use a technique called the minimum home range method. You've probably seen those maps where they connect the dots to show where an animal has traveled. Scientists do something similar with squirrels.
So they're basically mapping out the squirrel's movements to figure out the minimum area they use regularly.
Exactly. Researchers capture and mark individual squirrels, then release them back into their habitat. They meticulously record where each squirrel is spotted, and by connecting these points on a map, they can create a polygon that represents the minimum space used by that squirrel.
It's like a connect-the-dots puzzle that reveals the squirrel's secret hangout spots.
Precisely. And by analyzing these polygons for multiple squirrels, they get a picture of the overall home range size and how much they overlap within a population. What's interesting is that even though individual home ranges were relatively small, there was still quite a bit of overlap between them.
So it's like living in a neighborhood where everyone's yards kind of blend together, and you might bump into your neighbor while you're both out walking the dog.
Yeah.
Do you think this overlap leads to more interactions between the squirrels?
It certainly creates the potential for more encounters. And considering the skewed sex ratio we talked about earlier, I'd imagine those encounters could get pretty interesting, especially for the males.
Especially with those males having to cover more ground to find mates. It's like a constant game of musical chairs with more players than seats.
A very apt analogy. Now, remember how we were discussing that one male who went from a tiny home range to a much larger one? This study actually mentions another male who made a similar move.
Oh, right. The one who started out in a space smaller than a tennis court. What happened to him?
As he matured, his home range expanded dramatically as well, interestingly. He ended up in a completely different area, over 128 meters away from his original home range.
That's a pretty big move. It makes you wonder. Was he driven by the need for more food, better shelter, or perhaps the pursuit of a mate?
It's likely a combination of all those factors. As he grew, his needs changed, and he had to adapt to the pressures of adulthood in a competitive environment.
It's like he realized he needed to up his game to attract a mate, and decided to relocate to a more happening part of town.
But speaking of mating, this study focused a lot on home ranges and territoriality. Did it reveal anything about how these squirrels actually choose their mates? While the study didn't delve into specific mate choice behaviors, it did highlight that male northern palm squirrels outnumber females by more than 2 to 1.
Wow, that's quite a difference.
Oh.
So how does this skewed sex ratio affect their mating strategies?
It likely leads to increased competition among males. With fewer females available, those males need to work harder to stand out from the crowd.
I imagine it's pretty intense out there in the squirrel dating world. Do you think this influences the male's tendency to roam further?
It's definitely possible. If you're a male squirrel and your options are limited, you might be more likely to venture further afield in search of a mate.
That makes sense. And it adds another layer of complexity to understanding their behavior. It's not just about food, shelter, and territory. It's also about the social dynamics and mating pressures that shape their decisions. Now, you mentioned earlier that the study used a technique called the minimum home range method to track the squirrel's movements. Can you explain a bit more about how that works? I imagine it's not as simple as just following them around.
You're absolutely right. It involves a combination of capturing, marking, and observing the squirrels, essentially. Researchers would capture individual squirrels, mark them for identification, and then release them back into their habitat.
So how do they actually figure out where the squirrels are going? Do they have tiny GPS trackers on them?
Not quite. Researchers would carefully record the location of each capture and recapture event. By connecting those points on a map, they could create a polygon that represented the minimum area used by that particular squirrel.
It's like piecing together a puzzle to reveal the squirrel's secret travel routes.
Exactly. And the more capture points they have, the more accurate their estimate of the squirrel's home range. They also have to be mindful that they're only capturing a snapshot of the squirrel's movements. The actual home range might be larger, especially for those adventurous males.
It's amazing how much effort goes into studying these creatures. But all that data really paints a fascinating picture of their lives, doesn't it? We've learned about their home ranges, their territorial behavior, and even got a glimpse into their mating strategies.
It's remarkable how much information we can gather from their movements alone. And while the study focused primarily on spatial behavior, I think it also hints at something deeper: the complexity of their social lives.
I agree. And it makes me think, what would we discover if we could actually eavesdrop on their conversations? What secrets are they whispering to each other as they scurry through the trees?
That's a fascinating thought. Perhaps we'd learn even more about their social hierarchies, their mating rituals, and maybe even their individual personalities.
I bet there are some real characters out there in the squirrel world. We've already seen evidence of that with those males who went from modest beginnings to having much larger home ranges.
It's clear that these aren't just mindless creatures following instinct. They're adapting, strategizing, and making choices based on their individual circumstances and the social pressures around them.
And it makes you wonder, what other secrets are hidden within those squirrely brains? What else can we learn by observing their behavior and digging deeper into their world?
That's a question that researchers are still trying to answer, but I have a feeling those squirrels are holding on to plenty of secrets, just waiting to be discovered. Speaking of discoveries, remember how we discussed those range lengths? The study found that adult males traveled significantly further than females or subadults.
Right. Those males were the true explorers of the group.
Well, the researchers also looked at the range lengths of subadult squirrels, those who aren't quite adults yet.
Oh, interesting. So did those younger squirrels also show differences in how far they traveled?
Yes, they found that subadult males ventured out further than their female counterparts. Although both groups stuck relatively close to home, those young males were already displaying those exploratory tendencies.
It's like that phase in adolescence where you start pushing boundaries and venturing further from home. Except in this case, it's happening in a world of trees and nuts.
A very relatable comparison. It suggests that even at a young age, those male squirrels are preparing for the challenges of adulthood.
And those challenges might include finding a mate in a highly competitive environment.
Exactly. And the more they explore, the better their chances of finding the best resources and the most desirable mates.
It seems like exploration and adaptability are key to success in the squirrel world.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, what strategies do they use to navigate their complex social landscape? How do they make decisions about where to go, what to eat, and who to mate with?
Those are great questions. It's like we've only just scratched the surface of understanding their behavior. And now I'm even more curious about those territorial displays you mentioned earlier. You said they were most protective of their nests, shelters, and favorite tree branches.
That's right. Those are the areas where they're most likely to show aggression towards other squirrels.
But why those specific spots? What makes them so valuable that they're willing to fight over them?
Well, think about it from a squirrel's perspective. A nest or a shelter provides safety and protection from predators and the elements. Losing access to those resources could be detrimental to their survival.
So it's a matter of survival, not just personal preference. But what about those favorite perches on tree branches? What's so special about those?
Those spots might offer the best vantage points for spotting predators or potential mates, or they might simply be the most comfortable spots for resting and sunbathing.
So it's a combination of practical and personal reasons. But what's interesting is that they're not territorial about everything. Remember how we talked about them being tolerant in feeding grounds?
Yes, that's a great point. It seems like they understand that sharing is sometimes the best strategy, especially when resources are plentiful.
It's like they know when to pick their battles and when to just go with the flow.
Exactly. And that adaptability is probably a big part of what makes them so successful.
It's fascinating how even these seemingly simple creatures can display such complex behavior. And it makes you wonder, what else can we learn from them?
There's still so much to discover, and I think the best way to learn is to simply observe them in their natural habitat. Pay attention to their interactions, their movements, and their choices. You might be surprised by what you see.
That's a great point. Sometimes the most insightful observations come not from scientific studies, but from simply watching the world around us and asking questions. You know what's fascinating to me? It's how this study from 1968 still feels so relevant today.
It really highlights how fundamental these concepts of home range, territoriality, and mating behavior are to understanding animal populations.
Right. And even though it focused on a specific species in India, the insights we've gained can be applied to understanding squirrels and other animals all over the world.
Absolutely. These are universal principles that drive behavior across a wide range of species.
One of the biggest takeaways for me was that even seemingly simple creatures like squirrels have complex social lives and strategies for survival.
It's easy to underestimate their intelligence and adaptability, but when you look closely, you realize there's a lot going on beneath the surface.
Thinking back to that male squirrel who went from a tiny home range to a massive one, it almost sounds like a classic coming-of-age story.
It does, doesn't it? He started small and gradually expanded his territory as he matured, facing competition and challenges along the way.
It makes you wonder if he had to develop new skills and strategies to thrive in that larger, more competitive environment.
I'm sure he did. It probably involved learning how to navigate new social dynamics, outsmart rivals, and make the most of available resources.
I bet there were some real-life rocky moments in there, with him facing off against bigger, tougher squirrels.
I wouldn't be surprised. And through it all, he was ultimately driven by the same goals as any other squirrel: survival and reproduction.
Speaking of reproduction, we talked a lot about the skewed sex ratio in this population, with males outnumbering females by more than 2 to 1. What are the long-term implications of that imbalance? Does it affect things like population growth or genetic diversity?
Those are excellent questions. A skewed sex ratio can definitely have significant consequences for a population. In some cases, it can lead to increased competition among males, potentially affecting breeding success and overall population dynamics.
So it's not just about individual squirrels trying to find a mate. It also has implications for the entire population's health and stability.
Exactly, and it's important to remember that this study only provided a snapshot of the population at a specific point in time. Things might have shifted since then, with the sex ratio fluctuating based on various factors like environmental conditions, predator pressure, and even disease outbreaks.
It's like a constant balancing act, with the population adjusting to various pressures and changes in its environment.
Precisely. And that's why long-term monitoring is so important. It helps us understand how populations change over time and identify potential threats or areas for conservation efforts.
Now, we talked a lot about the scientific methods used in this study, like the minimum home range method. Are there any newer techniques or technologies being used today that might provide even deeper insights into squirrel behavior?
Absolutely. Technology has advanced significantly since 1968. Today, researchers can use GPS tracking devices to monitor animal movements with much greater precision and detail. They can even collect data on things like heart rate, body temperature, and activity levels, providing a more comprehensive picture of how animals respond to their environment.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like having a window into their physiological state, allowing us to understand how they cope with stress, conserve energy, and make decisions based on their internal needs.
Exactly. And this kind of data can be combined with genetic analysis to explore questions about kinship, dispersal patterns, and even the evolution of certain behaviors.
It's amazing to think how far we've come in terms of understanding animal behavior. And yet there's still so much more to learn, especially when it comes to the intricate social dynamics of creatures like squirrels.
There's always more to discover, and that's what makes this field so exciting. Every study, every observation opens up new possibilities and avenues for exploration.
So what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this deep dive into the world of the northern palm squirrel?
I hope they gain a deeper appreciation for the complexity and wonder of animal behavior, even in creatures we might consider commonplace. Next time you see a squirrel darting through the trees, take a moment to consider the incredible journey it's on, the challenges it faces, and the remarkable adaptations it employs to survive and thrive.
It's a reminder that there's a whole world of fascinating stories unfolding right under our noses, if we just take the time to look closely.
Absolutely. And those stories are full of surprises, insights, and a deeper understanding of our connection to the natural world.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, exploring the world of the northern palm squirrel through the lens of scientific research and our own curiosity.
It's been a delightful journey into the squirrely lives of these charming creatures.
And to you, our listener, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep observing, and keep asking questions about the world around you.
Because the more we understand about the lives of other creatures, the more we understand about ourselves and our place in this interconnected web of life.
Until next time, happy deep diving.